What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Night Owls podcast, your daily source for all things FAU. I'm your host, JJ Metz. Today, I'm joined by Hudson Friedman, as always, but we're also joined by a very special guest from Memphis Tigers on three on the Tigersportsreport.com, John Maddox. John, first off, thank you so much for coming on. Yeah, John, it looks like you're
Yeah,
on mute
I
again.
am. Yeah, there we go. Thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Technical difficulties as always, everyone. But John, I first off want to ask you about this Memphis program and the temperature with Memphis. You guys are 4-0 right now. You're coming off a big SEC win. You're receiving votes in the top 25. You're the favorites to make the college football playoffs out of the G5. What's kind of the temperature in the city of Memphis, in the atmosphere in the city right now? And how are you guys feeling overall?
Well, I think it's one of those things, other than Arkansas, Memphis hasn't really been tested to this point. So people are still a little, I don't want to say apprehensive, but not willing to get overly excited yet because if we're being real, Memphis has a history of dropping a game that they really need. Last year, for instance, it was UTSA, and that ended up costing Memphis a spot in the championship game. But I think this is the year that Ryan Silverfield needs to take that big step forward and win those big games. And that's, he's won some big games. I mean, Memphis is 4-0 against their last four Power Four opponents. But now it's time, as you guys know, the conference is everything. But there's also I think, guys, there's a little less pressure on Memphis and Tulane and Navy and North Texas. The American is so far ahead of the rest of the G5 that all you got to do is win the championship. And even if you're 10-2, 9-3, that's probably good enough to get you in the playoff. But Memphis fans are excited, I think, but that's tempered with, can they get to that South Florida game at 7-0? And, if they can win that, then I think that's when the excitement level really takes off. But again, they just, other than Arkansas, they just weren't tested against Chattanooga, weren't really tested with Georgia State or Troy. So, fans are kind of tempered a little bit.
Yeah, 100%, John. And I definitely agree with you. I do think the Arkansas win, though, is a bit of a test. That's a team that competed with a top 15 Ole Miss team. So, obviously, competing with them coming back from 18 points, the biggest comeback in the FBS, is a huge accomplishment and shows that you guys are tested. You kind of mentioned a little bit about the conference and how it is the best G5 conference. And I completely agree with you. But a lot of Memphis fans, and I've been seeing this on Twitter and all over social media for a while. You guys want to leave the conference. You guys want to get into a Power Four conference, whether it's the Big 12, whether it's the ACC. And for FAU fans, we're very fortunate to be in this conference because we're moving up. So I want to ask you, how do you view just FAU as a program? Because the FAU fans want to know how we're viewed from a team that has much more brand exposure, much bigger fan base, like a Memphis. So overall, when you hear the words FAU, what kind of comes to mind, and how do you feel about the program overall?
That's tough. And it's not hard to be respectful, but it's one of those things that, Memphis was wandering in the desert. Memphis was frankly FAU until 10 or 11 years ago, where it was like we just had no brand recognition. We were bad, frankly, for a very long time. I mean, we just had our seventh 10-win season in 110 years of football. So, we were kind of wandering through that desert a little bit. I think that the problem that the top tier is Memphis, Tulane, I guess South Florida now, Sleeping Giant, and then now you've got some, not Johnny come latelys, but North Texas, obviously Navy. I think the thought process is that FAU, Charlotte, UAB, even Rice to an extent, it kind of feels like they hold the bottom half of the league. And FAU took a pretty good step forward, but here's the thing that I would say to encourage FAU is it took Memphis forever to get the right coach, and that was Justin Fuente, and he was the right guy for the job and got the job done and elevated Memphis. And then the problem you have, and this is a problem FAU has had and a lot of schools, you got to stack coaches. Memphis hit with Fuente, then they hit a home run with Norvell, and it looks like they hit another home run with Brian Silverfield. So the issue is, I don't think Memphis looks down on FAU, but they've made no bones about it that they feel like they are a power conference team. Memphis, again, Tulane, kind of the top third of the conference, just feel like they're a power team, and because they've committed and they've won on the field. And I think we had Brandon O'Doy on last night or Tuesday on our show, and what he talked about is the lack of that commitment to FAU. And from a financial standpoint, things like NIL. And I think that's where Memphis feels like they have a big advantage. And it's not that they think less of FAU, they just don't feel like they belong in this league, because this feels like the bottom half of the league does feel a little bit like what they left so long ago when they left Conference USA. But I don't think there's any like ill will. I think it helped you guys in Memphis's eyes with basketball when you had Dusty May, right? And those were some absolute battles. And that was only good for the league when you had another team besides Memphis out there trying to run the table. So I don't think anybody dislikes FAU. I think it's more Memphis, Tulane, South Florida feels like they belong somewhere else and not with probably more Charlotte and Rice and UAB. I think those are really the ones that Memphis fans probably have the biggest problem with.
Yeah, John, that totally makes sense. 100% agree with you there. And, that kind of gives FAU fans a little bit of optimism. The fact that you felt like you were FAU 10, 11 years ago, to me, I'm thinking maybe we could get up to the brand exposure of a team like Memphis, or, up there maybe where if we have success in terms of football and basketball as well. And I kind of, not that I could fully relate to you, but in some sense I can kind of relate to what you're saying in terms of, basketball, because in basketball, you mentioned it, the year under Dusty made a first year in the conference. We were top 25, we were top 7 in the country for a majority of the year. So we kind of understand what it feels like when we go to Charlotte and beat them by 40 points in basketball. They're not Charlotte, Rice, UAB. We get it. And us in football, we haven't made a bowl since 2019. So that definitely makes sense that you view us holding the conference down. And that's not disrespectful. At least I don't take it disrespectful in any way.
Well, and the
Hudson,
other thing
go ahead.
and I said this about South Florida, and I'd say it about FIU too. There is no reason for a school in Florida to be bad at football. And we said that around I always said that around the Memphis program. Even with what is left when Mississippi and Alabama and Tennessee and Arkansas come into Memphis, you can still build a competitive team. Memphis recruits Georgia very heavily. They recruit Louisiana very heavily. And same thing with Florida. There is so much talent out there. But now with NIL, FAU frankly has to step up financially, because whether we like it or not, I mean, that's what it's about. So, yeah, I just think that FAU needs to make a financial commitment, because there's so much talent that there's no reason they can't get better quickly if the funds are there.
Yeah, 100%. You talk about the resources, the funds. I'd say outside of the big three, where you're going to obviously have the most of the 5 and the 4 stars go to the big three schools in Florida, Florida State, Miami, Florida. But then outside of those big three, maybe some 3 stars could come to FAU if we do provide the financial means and we can win those battles over a South Florida. But most likely we can't compete financially with the big three. Last one from me here for a bit. I'm going to go over to Hudson with his questions. I kind of want to ask you a little bit about your quarterback, Brendan Lewis. Obviously, this is a guy who's coming over from Nevada. He's a 5th-year senior, I believe, and he's had a successful season, throwing for over 800 yards. He also brings mobility with his dual threat ability and can really, provide a lot of yards through the ground, not just through the air. So that's a huge positive. And yes, he has three touchdowns, but he does have two interceptions, and his QBR ranks outside the top 55 in the country. So, what are kind of the flaws you see? Well, first off, how would you evaluate how he's been? What are kind of the flaws you've seen from him that maybe FAU's defense can exploit, if there's any? And overall, how would you say he's done throughout these first four games at Memphis?
Yeah, it's so hard because Memphis, if you ask Ryan Silverfield what he wants Memphis to be, and it's a run first team. And so it's really hard to evaluate a quarterback. Now, I will say that both Brian, who's also with On Three Memphis, and we've been chomping at the bit because we've said maybe a running quarterback, a true running quarterback, is what Memphis has missed and the part of the offense they need. Look, he had 103 yards on the ground last year, or last week, but he frankly missed 3 or 4 throws, had a couple overthrows. That's his big thing. I think there's some kind of hitch in his motion, and it looks like the ball kind of tends to sail on him a little bit. And as you guys know, when you are an athletic quarterback that runs, your accuracy can suffer a little bit if you're not fundamentally sound and don't get your shoulder squared to the line of scrimmage and don't get your feet back underneath you. So he's been a little late on some passes, but I think Memphis can kind of counteract that with more of the short passing game and let the playmakers get out and run. And I would give him probably a B. I mean, maybe a B minus because I think he's left some throws on the field, but it's been unbelievable to see him be able to carry the football. And, maybe my other knock on him is he tends to, it looks like, just pull it down and take off, maybe not giving the play enough time to develop. But he's a solid B minus B quarterback. It's huge that he's a fifth year senior. That helps so much because he brings in leadership. And I know we're probably going to get this, but also bringing in Cortez Braham, who was one of his receivers last year at Nevada. So somebody he's comfortable with is going to help him as they get along. But it takes 4 or 5 games, I think, for guys to gel, and I think that he's going to get better throwing the football because really, JJ, all he's got to be is adequate, right? Like he just has to be adequate throwing the football. He doesn't have to be great because Memphis has such a fantastic running game. But I give him a B. I give him an A plus for his running ability and his ability to see the hole. And although he does pull it too fast sometimes, I think when he decides I'm going to take the A gap, he takes the A gap. He doesn't, dance around. And you notice that against the touchdown, the 12-yard touchdown run against Arkansas, put his foot in the ground and he went. So, I would say maybe C in passing and A in rushing so far.
All right, John, I wanted to get to some questions here. So let's talk about more of the roster. So Sutton Smith last week against Arkansas, he turned some heads. He looked like he has that big playability with his breakaway speed. But beyond him, who else on this offense for Memphis poses a real threat that FAU may need to look out for?
Well, as I said, Cortez Braham is a guy that, Memphis has that can take the top off a little bit. And that's partially because he's so comfortable with Brendan. But Greg DeWosier, I mean, he is the Memphis X factor, and he's been banged up this year. Played some against Arkansas, but he is a game changer. Anytime he gets the ball in his hands, it's the potential to score a touchdown. But look, that's also Sutton as well. Memphis has got some, Bussy is a great receiver. Jamari Hawkins, Bryce Anderson. We're still waiting for him as tight end to kind of break out. Of course, we mentioned Braham, but those are the guys offensively. Memphis is kind of doing this by committee. Every week, there's been a different leading receiver. Memphis is averaging 9 guys catching footballs. So between that and the running game, what that does is it really puts defenses in a bind because you can't stack the box to stop Sutton and Greg because Memphis moves Sutton out to the slot sometimes and we'll put him in motion just to get him the ball. CJ Smith is another guy that Memphis is really high on, but his first touch as a Tiger last week was an interception on a throwback, but Sutton Smith was wide open. And I think the thing is Memphis has so many weapons that it's really hard to just say, all right, we're going to stop this guy. Although you can kind of do that with Braham right now because, that is Brendan's security, comfortable blanket. That's his security blanket. but I just think there's so many guys offensively that's really, really tough to say, all right, we're going to stop this guy. Um, but that being said, you say, you know what, we're going to let anybody but Sutton Smith beat us. If somebody else is good enough to beat us, it is what it is. But we're going to gang up on Sutton and not let him get in the open field. And that's kind of the game plan. But then, that's risk reward, right? Because then Greg DeBosier comes in and Frank Punch, Makari Bodiford. I mean, Memphis just has so much talent at the skill positions.
So it seems like you're rolling with Sutton Smith being the man that FAU has to lock down.
100%. And it's because he can beat you in so many ways. He can beat you in the return game. He's nearly broken 2 touchdowns this year in the return game. Obviously, with his feet, again, you can spread him out. You can get him the ball in space. He's just really hard to contain because he has such a unique skill set. And look, he didn't play last year. He got injured in the first series or in the second series of the first game last year. And so that's why we were kind of stunned. He's just one of these guys you just think's been here forever, but his career high before last week was 115 yards. So, he had 147, I think, last week. So he's the guy that if Zach Kittle and the coaching staff need the Pepto-Bismol bottle on the nightstand, he's the guy.
Yeah, 100%. That's very interesting that, he was hurt last year, randomly just pops out of nowhere. I've seen a lot of people talk about his NFL speed and how he is an NFL prospect overall. I also really found it interesting that you guys have 9 receivers that you could go to. It's really hard for FAU to be able to prepare for that. Coach Finellis, our secondary coach, will definitely have his hands full watching film, preparing for this offense. But for them to have and exceed in the running game and exceed in the passing game, Brandon Lewis has to have time. And that all starts in the trenches. That all starts in the offensive line. Can you just talk about Memphis's offensive line and how they've been with run protection and giving Lewis enough time to throw overall? And would you say this is a top 3 offensive line in the conference?
I mean, it's so hard to tell because really none of us have been tested, right? Like none of us have really kind of been tested. The offensive line is better than a lot of people thought, frankly, and that was one of the big areas of concern coming in because, as you guys know, like getting that chemistry together is really, really difficult. And you have a bunch of guys. Memphis has 70 new players on the roster this year. And that's really difficult through 3 or 4 weeks. But, we've got guys like Chris Adams that last week he got hurt and he was limping pretty good and they were going to pull him. And he's like, absolutely not. I'm going back in the game. And Memphis has been very, very good with run blocking. They've been pretty good with pass blocking. I think the problem maybe with them pass blocking is holding their blocks long enough. But some of that's on Brendan too. He's got to not panic and take off. But Memphis doesn't have they're not the biggest offensive line, and that's kind of how Memphis has built itself is they are speed oriented. Ryan Silverfield, offensive line coach, that's kind of his MO. And Memphis is another place. Memphis is really, really deep. And we'll play. Well, I want to say we played 16 guys last week. I mean, we're going to play a ton of guys, and it's just finding that right combination. But look, the numbers don't lie with the Memphis running game. That they're just road graders out there. And Memphis, though, is blessed that Sutton Smith and Brendan, they just need a crack. They don't need, these wide expanses. They just need an A gap or a B gap crack, or just maybe an outside with a tight end kicking out. I mean, there's so much talent in the backfield that I think it can sometimes hide some offensive line issues. They've had some pre-snap penalty issues. Drives me crazy because a lot of those issues could be stalled just by snapping the dang ball. But they've had a lot of false starts this year, and it's been the same player, Parker Mitchell, has started, has been, I think, has had 5 so far. They don't hold a lot. We had a lot of holding penalties. So, and they've kept Brendan pretty much upright when he drops back. So, it's just one of those things that's really hard unless you like really focus on it. It's really hard to tell with the offensive line. Again, they haven't really been tested until last week, and they held up really well against a huge Arkansas front 4.
And John, so we didn't get to talk about the other side of the ball. One of the biggest parts in football, defense wins championships. So defensively for Memphis, Memphis actually ranks second in the American right now. Who are the key names on that side of the ball that could maybe get to Kagan Velkamp, maybe intercept the ball? He's very costly with turnovers this year. Who are the key names that FAU maybe needs to be prepared for, and what's made this group so effectively early in the season?
Well, Cruz Law had a huge sack last week. He's a guy that, just as, it's cliche, but has that motor, right? Like he just keeps going. Um, Puda Walker's another big guy on the defensive line. William Whitlow's a returner. He had opportunities to go elsewhere. He said, "No, I want to come back." Jalen Bell is the guy that's, transferred in from, I think, Tennessee State. He's the guy, and he's the one that the coaches look. When we talked to Ryan in March, he's like, this is gonna be the dude. Like he's the guy, and he's been really, really effective. Um, but it's one of those things. I'm trying to pull up some numbers here. It's one of those things that, again, Memphis hasn't been the most tested team in the conference. So we're Memphis. One of Memphis's problems is frankly the back half, like the back end, right? And they lost Cortland Marsh, who was going to be their big leader on defense, safety. You've got guys though like Drew Watts and Sam Brumfeld who play at that linebacker position. Kamari Wilson had a pick last week, should have had 2 picks. Chris Bracey had the forced fumble at the end. So Memphis is figuring this out. But, where Memphis, I think, has excelled this year is they've been able to get really good pressure with 5 guys. And they don't have to, in years past, Memphis has to bring 6 or 7. And as you guys know, that makes the back half look even worse maybe than they are. So that's the key for Memphis is just, we say nothing deep and nothing cheap. You saw the first touchdown for Arkansas last week, a total bust by Memphis, leaves Rohan Jones wide open. And that's what Memphis can't afford to do, right? And that has plagued them in the last few years. But that Memphis run defense, that's the thing that I don't think FAU is going to be able to run the ball. And is because Memphis is just locking folks down up front with the defense. And that comes again, you're able to get there with 5. You don't have to bring all these exotic blitzes and bring safeties and all that, which Memphis does. But, they've played really vanilla so far this year because they haven't had to. And they showed some exotic, not real exotic, but some different stuff last week. But yeah, Cruz Law, Drew Watts, Sam Brumfeld, Chris Bracey, DeMarco Ward's had 2 pick sixes for touchdowns, 1 in each of the first 2 games. So, Jalen Bell's already got 13 tackles on the season. So, it's one of those things that the Memphis defensive front is really what's going to drive this. And, you can afford some cover 2, cover 3 if you're getting that pressure up front.
Yeah,
And
100.
now that since,
100.
sorry.
Go ahead, Hudson.
So now that we've talked about both offensive and defensively for Memphis, if FAU really wants a chance in this one to maybe shock the world here, do you think they would do it on the offensive side of the ball or the defensively? Where would they need to be more sharp to maybe shock the world here?
They need to shorten the game. That would be the first thing, establishing the run game. And, it's like if you can turn Memphis over, and that's not been, a thing that's happened this year. And frankly, Memphis has been very good. I want to say they've been plus 17 over the last season and a half. But I think that's the secret is run the ball, shorten the game, turn Memphis over, hope Memphis has a hangover. Because I'll tell you guys, and I'm not just saying this, I'm talking to you, this game made me nervous from day one. I said, Memphis is either going to drop Troy or they're going to drop FAU because they're either looking ahead to Arkansas or, hearing how great they are this week. But I don't know. I think this team's built a little different. But I think if FAU were to have a shot, it will be, turn Memphis over, um, keep that Memphis offense on the sideline. Memphis last week in the first quarter had 12 and a half minutes of possession. And our FAU can't afford to even be level in the time of possession. FAU has to keep Memphis on the sideline because of all those playmakers. But the problem with that too is Memphis is really good on third down. They're in the top 10 in the country on third down defense. But I think those are the two things. And number three, of course, hope. Memphis is hungover and has heard how great they are the last week and a half. So I don't think that would be the case, but I think those would be the three things that FAU could pull the upset with.
Yeah, John, I want to connect a couple things you just said there. So you just said, if FAU wants to win this game, they have to have a very long time of possession. They have to keep Memphis off the field. But then you also said before that Memphis' run defense, you can't really run the ball. So that's very problematic from FAU. Because if you want to milk the clock, if you want to keep the time of possession up, how do you do that? You run the football so that the clock continues to move. And that's a huge problem, I think, for FAU, because if you want to keep Memphis off, you have to run the ball. Fortunately for FAU, we really don't run the ball that much. We do have a three-headed monster: Jamari Sands, Caden Shields, Dutton, and Xavier Terrell. But really, we're an air raid offense. That's what Coach Kelly wants to do. He calls the offensive plays. We're going to throw the ball a lot. And when you were just talking about the defense a little bit before, Kane Velkim's very prone to turnovers. In the two FBS games he's played, in just 2 games, he's had 7 interceptions. So he's really turned the ball over. And those two teams, Maryland and FIU, those teams, they're good teams, but Memphis, I think, is better than both of the two teams. I think Memphis is going to be the hardest team FAU has played up to this point. I think them or Tulane is going to end up being the hardest team overall on the schedule. And the spread shows that. It shows how tough an opponent Memphis is going to be with their 13.5 points. They are favored by that. So, John, I want to ask you, Memphis is heavy favorites here, coming down to Boca. How do you think this game is going to go?
Well, I'll give that in a second, but I do want to say about the running game. Coach Mike Leach had this all figured out. If you can't run the ball, throw screens, throw slants, get the ball out of the quarterback's hand, basically extended running plays. I think that's how maybe FAU can run the ball. I mean, I just think Memphis is deeper and, I think they're bigger, stronger, faster. I think they have, Zach Kittle hasn't really had a chance to prove himself yet. So I think, Memphis has a better staff. I just think that as long as Memphis is focused, this game's over by half. And, but crazy things have happened. Night game, you're coming off an 11 a.m. game. You got another conference opponent next week. But I just think Memphis is built different. And I don't think FAU has the horses yet to stay with Memphis. I forget what I said on our show, but I mean, this feels like 38-17, maybe 42-17, 42-10. And I think it'll be a case, maybe Memphis is up 28-3 at the half and they just kind of coast away. But I think Memphis is going to come out and just throw everything at FAU and try to end this game early. And as my buddy Larry says, I think for the problem for FAU is it's going to get awful early or awful late, very early. And they can't run the ball. I just think Memphis wins this going away.
Yeah, that would totally make sense, because if we go back to the Maryland game, which is obviously the hardest competition FAU has faced so far, we were down 33-0 at the half, or 33-7 at half. And then the second half, we won the second half. Or we lost by 3, I think it was. So, yes, I could definitely see a similar case where you guys jump off to a very hot start and it's already over at halftime. So it really doesn't matter. We might win the second half, but it might be one of those same cases like Maryland where you guys are just up by a lot early. Me and Hudson are going to give our predictions. I'm going to go really quick. I'm going to agree a lot with John here. I think Memphis jumps out to an early lead. I think the talent is too much. There's a big gap. I like Memphis to win this one 35-17. Hudson, what about you?
Well, listen, the spread right now is at 13.5. And honestly, if FAU covers, it seems like more of like a more moral victory for FAU, right? So if they cover, it's great. But honestly, I feel like it's gonna be way closer than 13.5. I think it might be inside single digit territory. It could be, as you said, it could be potential trap game for Memphis, coming off of a tough SEC opponent, maybe overlooking the Owls. And I think the FU may have a few tricks up their sleeves, honestly. So if I had to make a score prediction, I would go maybe 30-21.
And you have Memphis winning that one?
I do, yes.
Yeah,
But
definitely.
one
Go
thing
ahead.
I'll say about what you said, JJ, about getting way behind early, we call those bus losses, meaning when you step off the bus, it's over. And what can't happen is Memphis gets the ball, scores. FAU gets the ball, Vanderkamp throws an interception, Memphis scores. Memphis kicks off, they fumble the kickoff, and then it's 21-0 before everybody gets back with their pronto pups. But I mean, I could see that too. Memphis has been very slow starting this year in all four games. They've kind of sputtered in the first half. And the thing is, the thing that FAU has to figure out is it is so hard to learn how to win. Um, and that's just people don't understand that always, but it's really difficult. And then when things go south, it's like, oh, here we go again. And then, you come out and it's like Mike Tyson said, everybody's got a plan until they get hit in the mouth. And I just think maybe early FAU can, maybe get something cheap, trick plays, onside kicks, bad turnover deep in territory. I mean, that's not inconceivable to me, that kind of score. But I just feel more like JJ and I probably are on that same page of Memphis is just going to come out and blitz FAU into oblivion, especially if they can't run the ball.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, Hudson, he's a newer FAU fan. I've been watching this team for 5 years. I've been seeing, us play Tulane, host Tulane at home, and just getting absolutely destroyed. So nothing this season makes me think that we're going to even compete. But as Hudson said, you mentioned that either FAU or Troy, you were worried about one of the two games. So you never know. You never know what could happen in college football. That's why it is the best sport. John, thank you so much for joining us today. You did fabulous job giving us insight on the Memphis Tigers. I definitely learned a lot about the team, the overall program, and the direction, and about the game. So thank you so much. We wish you guys the best of luck throughout the rest of the season. We're hoping you guys represent us well in the playoffs, assuming that you will make it. And yeah, we'll definitely connect during basketball season because that should be more of an interesting game, but you never know. Thank you so much, Hudson, for coming on. Thank you again, John. And we'll see you guys in the next one. Thank you so much for watching the Night Owl.